They thought her silence was weakness, until the day it became a weapon. In the scorched expanse of the Alvord Desert, where the U.S. Air Force carved out a place to forge airmen from dust and determination, she was an anomaly. Her name was Alara Voss, and she was a trainee in the 372nd Training Squadron, a ghost among boisterous youths barely out of their teens. She was older, the lines around her eyes etched not by laughter, but by a profound and settled weariness. Her hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a severe, regulation bun that seemed more a part of her than an accessory. She moved with a deliberate economy that the younger recruits mistook for slowness and the instructors for a lack of initiative. She was simply trainee Voss, the quiet woman, the one who would likely wash out before the cycle's end. Her days were a study in methodical patience. While others rushed through their tasks, eager to impress with speed, Alara treated each component with a reverence others reserved for prayer. She cleaned carbon scoring from an F-15's turbine blade, not as a chore, but as a ritual. Her hands, steady and sure, would trace the schematics of a C-130's hydraulic system as if reading scripture. Sergeant Reyes, a man whose voice was perpetually tuned to the frequency of disappointment, would watch her, a cynical smirk playing on his lips. He saw a woman clinging to the bottom rung, perhaps a midlife crisis pushing her into a world she couldn't comprehend. "Voss," he'd bark, his voice cutting through the hangar's metallic symphony. "Are you polishing that actuator or trying to divine the future from it? Pick up the pace." Alara would simply look up, her gaze calm and untroubled, offer a quiet "Yes, Sergeant," and return to her work, her pace unchanged. Her perfection was unnerving. Her tools were always laid out in perfect order, gleaming. Her diagnostic reports were flawless, devoid of the minor errors that plagued even the brightest of her peers. This precision was not seen as competence, but as obsession, the strange habit of a woman out of place. In the barracks, she was a void. The young men and women filled the space with loud music, crude jokes, and anxieties about the next inspection. Alara sat on her bunk, mending a small tear in her uniform with tiny, perfect stitches, or reading a worn paperback with a faded cover. She didn't participate in their camaraderie, nor did she rebuff it. She simply existed outside of its radius, a solitary planet in a loud, chaotic solar system. They called her the specter behind her back, a name born of both mockery and a sliver of unease. There was something about her stillness that felt ancient, something in her silence that felt heavier than simple shyness. Overseeing this crucible of training was Colonel Marcus Vance. He was a man forged in the unforgiving skies of two wars, his face a roadmap of command decisions and sleepless nights. He believed in pressure, in heat, in the relentless stripping away of weakness until only strength remained. From the window of his office overlooking the sprawling training grounds, he observed the trainees. He noticed Alara. He saw what everyone else saw, a woman past her prime, a quiet liability. He made a mental note to check her file, suspecting she was a transfer from a non-combat role, someone looking for a pension and a quiet final tour. His duty was to build warriors, not manage misplaced civilians. He dismissed her from his thoughts, another piece of administrative chaff to be dealt with later. The rhythm of the base was dictated by the sky. Blue, clear skies meant training flights from dawn till dusk. The air would thrum with the roar of engines, a constant reminder of their purpose. But the desert sky was a fickle master. On the third week of the training cycle, the forecast began to speak of a change. A low-pressure system was churning far to the east, a meteorological beast gathering strength. The reports were clinical, but the old hands on the base knew what they meant. A hubbub was coming, a wall of sand and fury that could strip paint from a jet and blind a man in seconds. The initial predictions gave them 12 hours. Colonel Vance ordered standard preparations. Secure loose equipment, double-check hangar seals, prepare for a lockdown. But the desert did not respect meteorology. The beast was moving faster than predicted. New reports crackled over the radio, the voices of the weather squadron tight with urgency. The storm had accelerated. It was a monster, a towering, roiling mass of sand and wind a mile high. It would be upon them not in 12 hours, but in 2. Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into the base's disciplined atmosphere. Every aircraft left on the tarmac was a multi-million-dollar target. The order came down, sharp and absolute. Get everything inside. Now, the base exploded into a frenzy of controlled chaos. Seasoned ground crews worked alongside raw trainees, their movements swift and desperate. The air filled with the whine of tow tractors and the shouts of crew chiefs. Alara, assigned to a team securing a squadron of training jets, worked with her usual unsettling calm. As others fumbled with tie-down chains and chocks, their hands shaking with adrenaline, her movements remained fluid and certain. She secured her assigned aircraft, her knots perfect, her checks thorough, her focus absolute. She was an island of tranquility in a sea of escalating panic. The main transport hangar, Hangar 4, was their biggest challenge. It was the only one large enough to house the base's prize asset, a WC-135 Constant Phoenix, a specialized atmospheric sniffing aircraft nicknamed the Whisper Wind. It was a crucial piece of national security hardware, laden with sensitive, irreplaceable technology. As the last of the smaller fighters were towed to safety, the massive, 30-ton doors of Hangar 4 began to close. They slid along their tracks with a low groan, 2 giant steel shields against the coming apocalypse. And then, with a horrifying screech of tortured metal, the right side door shuddered to a stop. It was jammed, leaving a 20-foot gap, an open wound. The Whisper Wind was still outside, exposed on the tarmac, a helpless giant. Colonel Vance was there in an instant, his face a mask of cold fury. The wind was already picking up, whipping sand into stinging projectiles. The sky to the east was no longer blue, but a bruised, terrifying brown. Maintenance crews swarmed the jammed door, their diagnostic laptops open, their voices tight with jargon and frustration. "It's the main drive motor. It's overloaded," one shouted. "The voltage is dropping. We need to reset the whole system," another yelled. Their solutions were by the book, logical, and far too slow. Resetting the system would take at least 20 minutes, time they did not have. The storm was a visible, advancing wall now, swallowing the horizon. Alara had finished her tasks. She stood near the back of the crowd, her expression unreadable as she watched the engineers' frantic, fruitless efforts. She wasn't looking at the motor or the control panel they were clustered around. Her eyes were tracking higher, following the thick hydraulic lines that fed the drive mechanism. Her gaze was intense, analytical, as if she were seeing not just the metal and fluid, but the flow of energy within. She saw it then, a detail so small it was almost invisible. A slight, almost imperceptible warp in a secondary line, near a joint that bore the scar of an old, minor impact. The main drive wasn't failing, it was being starved. The pressure was bleeding out through a hairline fracture, creating a ghost in the machine that their diagnostics couldn't see. She moved. Her quiet, deliberate steps carried her forward through the knot of anxious airmen. She didn't push, she simply found the gaps, flowing through the chaos like water. She reached the edge of the circle of engineers, right behind Sergeant Reyes, who was shouting instructions that were being lost to the rising wind. "Get back to your station, Voss," he snapped without looking, assuming it was one of his trainees getting in the way. She ignored him. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the noise with the clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. It was directed at the chief engineer, a harried master sergeant with grease on his face. "The pressure is ghosting," she said. The term was archaic, a piece of old-school engineering slang that hadn't been in a technical manual for decades. "It's not the main drive. It's the secondary actuator line, top quadrant. The check valve is compromised." The master sergeant glanced at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "What are you talking about? Who is this?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Get her out of here." But Colonel Vance had heard. He had been focused on the engineers, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt. But Alara's voice, and more importantly, her words, had snagged his attention. ghosting, actuator line. That wasn't the language of a basic trainee. It was the language of a specialist, of someone who didn't just read the manual but had written it. He turned his full attention to her, his eyes narrowing. He saw the quiet certainty on her face, the complete absence of doubt. It was the look of a professional who had already solved the problem and was merely waiting for the world to catch up. As she turned a step back, obeying the chief's dismissal without argument, a sudden, violent gust of wind tore across the tarmac. It ripped at their uniforms, a physical assault from the approaching storm. The loose sleeve of Alara's BDU shirt was thrown back, exposing her left forearm to the harsh hanger lights for a fraction of a second. And Vance saw them. They were not the scars of an accident. They were faint, a web of silvery, gossamer lines that shimmered on her skin. They were precise, geometric, like the traces of a printed circuit board etched into flesh. A burn, but not from fire. It was an electrical burn, patterned and deliberate. His breath caught in his throat. His mind, a cold repository of classified memories, flashed back a dozen years to a briefing room in a location that didn't officially exist. He remembered a slide on a screen, a grainy image of a body recovered from a black site after a disastrous mission. The briefer had pointed to similar marks on the corpse's arm, the signature of their neural interface equipment. The briefer had explained in a hushed tone. A direct contact overload. It's how we identify them. The ghost techs of the 7th Special Operations Group. Codename, Phantoms. A unit so secret that its existence was denied even at the highest levels. They were legends, myths whispered about in secure comms channels. Specialists who could interface directly with hostile technology, who could disable an enemy network not with a keyboard, but with their own nervous systems. They were all believed to be gone, wiped out in a single, catastrophic operation called Nightingale. The file was sealed, the unit officially erased from history. The wind howled, a shriek of rage. The storm was almost upon them. Vance's mind snapped back to the present, the past and present colliding with the force of a thunderclap. The quiet woman, the ghost, the silver scars. It was her. It had to be. He moved, his own body suddenly electric with a new, stunning purpose. He pushed past the stunned master sergeant. "Hold!" he roared, his voice the pure, unadulterated sound of command. Every man froze. All eyes snapped to him. "Listen to her," he commanded, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. He pointed a finger at Alara. "Everyone, you listen to her. Give her whatever she asks for. Now." The shift in the hangar was instantaneous and absolute. The colonel's word was law, his tone leaving no room for question. Dismissive glances turned to gaping, confused stares. Alara didn't acknowledge the sudden change in her status. She showed no surprise, no triumph. It was as if she had expected this all along. She simply turned back to the malfunctioning door, her focus total. "I need a T-47 bypass kit and a field-calibrated induction welder," she said, her voice still quiet but now amplified by the sudden silence around her. The master sergeant stared blankly. "A T-47? Sir, we haven't stocked those in 15 years. It's obsolete tech." "Then find one," Vance snarled, his eyes never leaving Alara. A young airman, his face pale with awe, spoke up. "Sir, there's one in the historical display case in the main lobby. The old tech exhibit." "Get it," Vance ordered. The airman sprinted away. Alara was already at the control panel, her fingers flying across the surface, pulling up diagnostic submenus that the other engineers hadn't even known existed. The airman returned, panting, carrying a dusty case. Alara took it from him without a word. Her hands, which they had all seen as slow and hesitant, were now a blur of controlled, precise motion. She opened the case, her fingers selecting tools with the innate familiarity of a concert pianist choosing keys. She moved to the hydraulic housing, her body contorting to fit into the cramped space. She didn't seem to notice the grit-laden wind that now tore at her, or the way the hangar lights flickered under the strain of the base's power grid. She worked with a speed and grace that was inhuman. She stripped wires, clamped the bypass unit onto the ancient valve, and fired up the induction welder. A low hum filled the air, and a faint blue light emanated from the complex joint she was working on. It was a dance of pure competence, a symphony of skill that left everyone around her breathless. She was not repairing the machine. She was communing with it, speaking a language of voltage and pressure that only she understood. She rerouted the hydraulic fluid, sealing the microscopic fracture with a pinpoint weld and forcing the system's full power back into the main drive. With a final decisive click of a tool, she pulled back. She looked up at the massive, stalled door. "Try it now," she said, her voice almost lost in the storm's overture. The master sergeant, his face a mask of dumbstruck reverence, hesitantly pressed the close button on the main console. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, shuddering groan, the 30-ton door moved. It slid, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, across the remaining gap. The sound of its movement was a prayer answered. It sealed shut with a deafening clang that echoed through the hangar, a sound of final, triumphant safety. The last sliver of the outside world vanished. A second later, the full fury of the hubbub hit the building. The walls of the hangar vibrated from the impact, a solid roar of wind and sand that would have torn the whisper wind to pieces. But the plane was safe. They were all safe. Inside, the world was still. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows. The only sound was the muffled rage of the storm outside and the heavy breathing of the men and women who had just witnessed a miracle. They stood coated in a fine layer of dust, staring not at the sealed door, but at Alara Voss. She had already turned away. She walked to a nearby workbench, picked up a clean rag, and began methodically wiping the grease and dust from her hands. Her expression was the same as it always was, calm, distant, unreadable. The savior of their most valuable asset looked like she had just finished a routine oil change. In the storm-enforced stillness that followed, the base held its breath. The world outside was a maelstrom of sand, but inside Hangar 4, an entirely different storm was brewing in the minds of those who had watched Alara work. Colonel Vance felt a tremor of something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine, unadulterated awe. He retreated to the emergency command center. The image of those silver scars burned into his memory. On a secure terminal, he pulled up trainee Voss's file. It was exactly as he had suspected, a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Alara Voss, age 39, transfer from a 78th Logistics Readiness Squadron, Ramstein. No commendations, no citations, no disciplinary actions, no real history at all. She was a ghost on paper, a carefully constructed identity designed to be overlooked. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing archives far deeper and more classified. He searched for Operation Nightingale. The file was heavily redacted, locked behind 7 layers of security protocols that he barely had the clearance to bypass. But he was a colonel and the base commander, and he pushed through. The after-action report was stark clinical. A mission to infiltrate and neutralize an enemy nation's advanced, autonomous drone network. The mission had gone sideways. The Phantoms, a team of 6, were compromised. The report detailed their last stand. It mentioned the team's lead tech, a specialist with the call sign Echo, who in a final act of sacrifice had manually interfaced with the drone network's central command hub. She had channeled its entire power grid through her own neural link, creating a catastrophic feedback loop that fried the entire system, grounding the enemy's air power for a decade. The resulting electrical backlash was unsurvivable. Echo was listed as killed in action, body not recovered but presumed vaporized. The report included a single addendum from the mission's intelligence officer. Identifier for Phantom operatives, if remains are ever found, is a unique bioelectrical burn scarring on the inner forearm from repeated use of the interface device. Vance leaned back in his chair, the hum of the command center's servers filling the silence. Echo. The name was perfect, a sound that travels and returns, but whose source remains unseen. She hadn't died. She had survived, somehow, and chosen to disappear into the one place no one would ever think to look for a hero of her caliber, the bottom rung of the ladder. She had sought anonymity, a quiet penance, or a simple peace in the dust and grime of a training base. Meanwhile, in the dim light of the barracks, the atmosphere around Alara had undergone a profound transformation. The space she occupied was no longer a void of awkwardness, but a pocket of reverential silence. The young trainees who had once mocked the specter now looked at her with a mixture of fear and wonder. They gave her a wide berth, as if she might suddenly erupt into blue light and weld their bunks together. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged with unspoken questions. Sergeant Reyes approached her. The usual arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by a stiff, uncertain humility. He stood before her bunk for a long moment before he found his voice. "Voss," he said, his tone quiet, respectful. Where did you learn to do that?" Alara looked up from the technical manual she was reading, the same one that had been declared obsolete just hours before. Her eyes held his for a second. There was no judgment in them. "No, I told you," so there was only a deep, settled calm. "I read the manual, Sergeant," she said, her voice a soft murmur. She then looked back down at the page. The conversation, for her, concluded. Reyes stood there a moment longer, a man completely recalibrated, before nodding slowly to himself and walking away. Colonel Vance made one final call. He used a satellite phone, punching in a number he had not dialed in over a decade. It belonged to a retired general, a man named Peterson, who had been the director of Special Projects Command during the era of the Phantoms. The voice that answered was old and gravelly. "Vance, this had better be about the end of the world." "It might be, sir," Vance said quietly. "It's about Operation Nightingale." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "That's a cold file, Marcus. A deep 1 inch. I think I found Echo," Vance said, the words feeling momentous as he spoke them aloud. Another long pause. Then, a heavy sigh from the general. "Is she alive?" "Very much so. She's a trainee mechanic at my base." Peterson let out a low, weary chuckle that held no humor. "Of course she is. That sounds just like her. She never wanted the medals. She just wanted the work to be done." He grew serious again. "Listen to me, Marcus. You didn't find her. You saw a ghost. A trick of the light. Let her be. That woman died on a mountain halfway across the world so that the rest of us could sleep at night. She has earned the right to whatever peace she can find. Do you understand me? Her file remains sealed. She does not exist." "I understand, General," Vance said. "She never existed." He ended the call, the general's words solidifying his own resolve. The next morning, the storm had passed. The desert air was washed clean, the sky a brilliant, depthless blue. The damage to the base was minimal, thanks to the secured hangars. Training resumed, but the universe had tilted on its axis. The instructors no longer barked at Alara. They watched her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and deference. They saw the way she guided a fumbling young trainee through the complex calibration of a targeting pod sensor, her patience infinite, her instructions simple and clear. They were not just watching a trainee, they were watching a master at work. From his office window, Colonel Vance observed the scene on the hangar floor below. He saw Alara, a quiet figure in a sea of green uniforms, moving with purpose among the machines she so clearly understood. He had made his decision. He walked down from the command tower, his boots echoing on the concrete floor of the hangar. The usual noise and chatter died down as he approached. He didn't walk to Alara. He stopped in front of Sergeant Reyes, who immediately snapped to attention. "Sergeant," Vance said, his voice carrying across the hangar. "Effective immediately, Trainee Voss is assigned as your assistant instructor for the Advanced Diagnostics and Repair Module." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "Her assessments are final. Her word on any technical matter is to be considered a direct order from me. Is that understood?" Reyes's face was a study in solemn comprehension. The man who had once mocked her for being too slow now looked at her with something approaching worship. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice firm. "Crystal clear, sir." Vance allowed his gaze to shift to find Alara. She was standing by the massive engine of the Whisper Wind, the aircraft she had saved. She met his eyes across the cavernous space. For a fleeting second, their gazes locked. He saw no hint of triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at her sudden vindication. He saw only a quiet, weary acceptance. She hadn't sought this. She hadn't wanted the recognition. The work was its own reward. Vance gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of immense respect, a silent acknowledgement of the hero standing before him in the borrowed humility of a trainee's uniform. He turned then and walked away, his duty done. The life she had built for herself here was now protected. The invisible shield of his authority would allow her to continue her quiet existence, to be the ghost she wanted to be, only now with the tools and freedom she deserved. The life of the hangar slowly resumed around her, but the quality of the sound had changed. The clatter of tools and the shouts of airmen were now underscored by a new reverence. Alara turned back to the great machine. She reached out and rested her hand on the cold aluminum skin of the engine nacelle, a silent communion between two quiet partners, two entities built for difficult missions. Her hand, already stained with a fresh streak of hydraulic fluid, covered the spot where, just beneath the sleeve of her uniform, lay the faint, silver scars that told the true story. She picked up a torque wrench, its polished steel gleaming under the bright hangar lights. There was a bolt that needed tightening, a system that needed balancing. She was Alara Voss, a simple mechanic, and there was work to be done. The silence that surrounded her was no longer one of dismissal, but of deep and profound respect. It was the sound of a legend breathing,